welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're taking a look at the 2019 movie called Midway. Now, in case it's been a little bit since you've seen it, let's hop right into a quick synopsis. Directed by Roland Emmerich, Midway depicts the events leading up to and including the Battle of Midway during World War II. But the movie covers a lot more than Midway itself. It actually starts with the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, which draws the United States into World War II. We see other battles and key engagements at the Marshall Islands, even the Doolittle Raid, the aftermath of the Battle of Coral Sea, and we also see the American cryptographers gathering intelligence to predict an attack on Midway. And despite some initial setbacks, the movie shows how all these events feed into the US victory in the Battle of Midway as they destroy multiple Japanese aircraft carriers, something that the movie's marketing claims turned the tide of the war. Now, if you're a longtime listener to Based on a True Story, you'll know that we covered Midway a few years ago, back on episode number 158 with Craig Simons. That was a fantastic episode, if I do say so myself, and we are not replacing it today. This is a supplement to that. So if you are a World War II history buff, I would highly recommend you give that one a listen as well. But why are we covering the 2019 Midway movie again? Can I tell you a little story behind the mic about how this episode came to be? It involves not only this episode, but an exciting announcement that I have for you too. So even though we've already learned about the 2019 Midway movie before, I've been on the hunt for someone to talk about the classic 1976 film of the same name. You see, that film was one of my late father's favorite World War II movies. So it's a movie that I've seen many, many times growing up. Now, the story about today's episode started when I was looking for someone for the 1976 film. So I reached out to Dr. Frank Blasich. He is the curator of military history, Division of Military and Society at the National Museum of American History. Dr. Blasich recommended John Parshall as the co-author of Shattered Sword as the best person to talk to about the 1976 Midway movie. So I asked John Parshall if he wanted to come on the show to talk about the 1976 movie. And honestly, John's reply surprised me. First, he told me that he was one of the historical consultants on the 2019 movie of the same name. I had no idea because John is not actually credited in the movie, even though he helped work on it. Secondly, John admitted that he hasn't seen the 1976 movie since it was in the theaters. So he pitched me an idea. What if we were to watch the 1976 movie with him together? So I'm happy to announce that John and I will be watching the 1976 Midway movie together, John's first time seeing the movie in almost 50 years, and we're inviting you to join us. We're doing this as a YouTube premiere. Join us on June 4th, the anniversary of the Battle of Midway, on the Based on a True Story YouTube channel, or there's a link to it in the show notes for this episode to catch that. Okay, so that's obviously in the future. What about this episode? Well, as I mentioned, John was also a historical consultant on Roland Emmerich's 2019 Midway movie. So even though we've talked about the 2019 movie before, how could I pass up the chance to supplement that and talk to someone who helped out with the historical accuracy of the movie? John also pointed out that he hasn't watched the 2019 movie since it was released either. That's a lot newer and a lot fresher on the mind. Now, as a full disclosure, I'm recording this intro after I've already had the conversation with John. So I know that you are in for an amazing discussion with tons of information about the true story behind Roland Emmerich's Midway movie. But before we talk to John about the movie, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Bruno Gatto's heroic scene in the movie really happened. Number 2, the movie doesn't show the Battle of Coral Sea because it doesn't really need to. Number 3, American torpedo planes sacrificed themselves to win the Battle of Midway. Got them? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie, and of course we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with John Parshall about the historical accuracy of Midway. Before we dig into some of the details of the movie and how it portrays things, I know it's been a little bit since you've seen Midway, but from an overall perspective, if you were to give it a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would you give it?
oh, C plus, something like that. And understand I'm a tough grader. And understand too that I've also worked on a lot of TV shows and in a historical context. And whenever you get called in as an historian to work on one of these things, you have to understand from the get-go that your role is damage control, right? There's always going to be stuff in here that's gonna set your teeth on edge. And your job is to really, as much as possible, try to prevent as much of that as possible. And the other thing, to be quite honest, okay, so they dragged me in late as a historical consultant on this movie, and right off the bat, the first thing I offered was like, I'd love to, fact check your script, and they were like, oh no, we've got that covered, and which, from my standpoint, is kind of bizarre. You've just hired the guy that wrote the book on Midway that's come out in the last 20 years, and you don't want me to look at your script. Okay, dude, whatever. But that's kind of what went down. So I didn't have any idea what I was going to see until I literally walked into the theater and saw it on the screen. So let's just say that from a hardcore historian perspective, if you were to take a shot every time there was an inaccuracy, you'd have been in the ER within like half an hour on this movie. There were just, and some of my really hardcore friends were just like, oh, yeah. And I was like, let's just chill here and understand the constraints of the visual medium and the fact that we have to tell this story from a very compressed standpoint. So I'll give you the lowdown at the very end as to why I actually do think that this movie did move the ball ahead on the historiography on this battle. And so it was a good thing from that standpoint. But there were a lot of little nitpicky details that for me just like, that's wrong. So anyway, there you go.
Well, I have to ask that. I mean, if they brought you in as a consultant, but they didn't let you see the script, why did they? What did you do? What would you say you do here?
Right. So they really brought me in because my expertise is on the Japanese side of the battle. And so they had me, running down really obscure stuff like, we need line drawings of the admiral's launches. Can you tell us what color the interior bulkheads were on the battleship Nagato and that kind of stuff? And like, okay, yeah, I can do that for you, dudes. But again, I really am more of a big picture guy to start with. So whatever. Anyway, that's what I did.
So it's more like they already had the script in place and it was like, okay, we want these little minutia of details and okay.
Ding, ding, ding. Yep.
I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if we go back to the movie, even though the movie is called Midway, it actually starts with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And the movie suggests that there's an intelligence officer named Edwin Layton who knew about the attack before it was going to happen, even tried to warn some officials, but they all ignored him. And according to the movie, this then turns out to be a big reason why people end up believing his intelligence about the Battle of Midway later on. So is the movie correct to suggest Layton's intelligence about the attack at Pearl Harbor was ignored, and that was a big reason why the intelligence about the Battle of Midway was believed later?
Nah, I think that's a bit of a conflation. Okay, so let's just set the stage. Layton was an officer on Admiral Kimmel's staff, who was the commander at Pearl Harbor, who ends up getting scapegoated and disgraced and drummed out. And then Layton will be rolled forward to be an intel officer on Nimitz's staff when Nimitz comes in and takes over. After the war, Layton wrote a very important book, and he rightly laid a lot of responsibility for what happened to Admiral Kimmel and the fleet at the feet of people back in D.C., particularly a guy named Richmond Kelly Turner, who was one of the main planning officers back in D.C. And his main accusation is, look, you guys had broken Japan's diplomatic codes called Purple, and you were reading a lot of traffic there. You could have done a better job of telling Kimmel and his army counterpart, a guy named General Short, war is coming, and you guys need to button down your commands. There was no specific intelligence, I would argue, that pointed directly at Pearl Harbor. You have to understand that before the war, there's a ton of intel running around, and there's a lot of there's a lot of what I would call false positives and not even false positives. The truth is that right before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are moving ships all over the place because they're not just doing Pearl Harbor. They're going to be attacking and landing troops down in Malaya to go down after Singapore. They're very shortly going to be landing troops on the Philippines and going after that archipelago. So the Japanese initial offensive is incredibly complex and widespread and has troop transports and naval vessels running all over the Western Pacific. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier force has gone dark. We're not getting any signals from them. So you've got this negative intelligence there. What does going dark mean? So ex post facto, after the war, could you go back and pick out the 3 or 4 little, breadcrumbs that said Pearl Harbor? Yeah, but in a pre-war environment where you don't have a lot of people in intel at this point, and you're not reading very much of the message traffic at all, how do you pick out those breadcrumbs that is the smoking gun that says Pearl Harbor is the place we're going to get attacked? So the movie is definitely playing fast and loose there. I am very much in the non-conspiracy camp that says we did not know, that no one really knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be the place that the hammer was going to fall. But Leighton is correct in saying, yeah, but we weren't getting enough proddings from DC at a local level just to say, button down, because we think there is a war coming.
And talking about Leighton's intelligence, and in the movie we see there's Leighton, of course, but behind Leighton is a man named Joseph Rochefort, who in turn we see have a room full of former musicians from the band on USS California that he's turned into the intelligence team breaking down ciphers. How much of that is true?
Some of that is true. I mean, Rochefort very much is true. Rochefort is this eccentric guy, a brilliant Japanese language specialist, and has a really good ear for, putting together these intel puzzles. And so Leighton and Rochefort had been Japanese language students together. They have known each other for a fairly long time. And so you can think of Leighton as the interface to the admirals, whereas Rochefort is running this dungeon, down in Pearl Harbor that is actually doing the code breaking. Yes, there were some bandsmen down there. It was a really misfit sort of outfit. So there's another guy, is not even in the movie, a kid named Max Showers, who is a journalism major. He's just recently graduated from college. He comes out to Pearl Harbor right after the attack, and he's immediately put into a replacement depot because they don't know what to do with a journalism major, right? And the Repple-Depple officer one day gets a request from this outfit called Hypo, which is Rochefort's code breakers. And he goes to Mac and he's like, they're telling me they need a warm body down there. I can't spare anybody, but I can spare you. And so he, shoves this kid Mac down into the basement. Mac Showers is going to go on to retire a rear admiral in naval intelligence. So he turns out to have a knack for it, and goes on to have a sterling career. But yeah, at this point in time, that code breaking unit is extremely understaffed, and Rochefort is grabbing people, from wherever he can and trying to slot them into positions where they can do some good.
Was there any, when you're saying that and then mixing that with what you're talking about earlier, where the carriers disappeared, was that ever a consideration of, just because there was a lack of personnel in intelligence, that maybe we're not getting everything, and maybe that's the reason why some of this is missing? Is it just on our side?
Some of it, it's really more to do with just the nature of code breaking. We, ex post facto, have this mental image that if I've broken a code, that means I'm reading all of the messages, right? And that ain't true. I mean, even though we had broken the Japanese operational code, JN25B, before Midway, we're only reading like maybe 10% of the code groups in that thing. Okay, so the other things that we're doing are things called traffic analysis, which is keeping tabs on all the just the volume of radio signals that are going on between individual ships, which we can identify in some cases. So let's say that I know that this call sign is associated with battleship Haruna, which is a battleship that often operates with their carrier group. And all of a sudden, I notice that Haruna is generating a lot more message traffic than she normally does. That's interesting. So that might be an indication that the carrier group is going to be up to some new operation. And I broke this one code group in this one message that seems to indicate that there might be an operation aimed at the Central Pacific. I wonder. So you're putting together all of this enormous puzzle with all of these moving pieces and trying to draw associations between individual ships and code group this, and it's really, really complex.
That paints a great picture of why in the moment, or I guess in retrospect, it's easier to say, oh yeah, okay, these are the pieces that said it was Pearl Harbor, but in the moment, that doesn't necessarily mean
right for
sure, in this to act on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One thing I do want to point about that of the Pearl Harbor sequence there is that the Star Wars Canyon sequence where Luke is flying down the canyon, to drop his bomb in the thermal duct or whatever. That one sequence has informed so many war movies since that time, because one of the things you'll see is when you open on this Midway movie, you've got this scene of Pearl Harbor, our ships are being bombed and blah, 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 blah. And you've got a Zero fighter that like flies down, between the masts of two of these battleships. It's just like, it takes you right back to 1977, And in actuality, okay, so there's one of the things that as an historian, you're like, okay, I just took another shot there because there's no way in hell that a Zero was flying between the masts of the battleship. That's nonsense. But anyway, you see that kind of thing.
That's multiple shots there for that.
Yeah, for sure. It's all good.
Yeah. Oh, if we go back to the movie, after the attack at Pearl Harbor, we see Admiral Nimitz sending Halsey and the carrier USS Enterprise to the Marshall Islands. This is February 1st, 1942. And when they get there, there's our pilots attacking Japanese airfield. And then they realize there's a second airfield on the island that didn't know about ahead of time. So then the movie shows Dick Best, one of the pilots, go off to attack the other airfield with a dive bomber. Very cinematic move where we see Best managing to get a bomb off just away, and then he flies away from the ball of fire and from the bomb. And then the movie shifts back to the carrier Enterprise, where we see another very cinematic scene. The Japanese bombers are attacking the American ships, and Nick Jonas's character, Bruno Gaido, hops on one of the machine guns, the seat of the plane on the deck, and he shoots down a bomber that's about to ram the carrier. How much of that actually happened?
Okay. Let's actually start with the last one first. Bruno Gaido did that. Okay. Yeah. So the Enterprise was under attack by a group of Japanese Betty bombers, and one of them got pretty close to the Enterprise, and Gaido jumped in the back seat of an SBD and grabbed one of the twin 30s and yanked it around and was doing his thing. I don't think that he actually shot that bomber down. The bomber had already been damaged beforehand and was actually knew that and was making sort of an early version of a kamikaze run on Enterprise. But Gaido and the other gunners are all blazing away at this thing, and it comes right over the flight deck, skims and hits a couple of the aircraft on the deck before it goes over the side and lands in the water and goes kaboom. So, yeah, Gaido was crazy brave, and he rightly deserved the honor that he gets later on. In fact, he gets called up to the bridge on Enterprise by Halsey, and right after that, Halsey is like, who are you, son? And I'm, Gaido armament, third class. And he's like, well, you're now an armorer's mate first class. Good job. So that's all legit. As far as the Marshall raids, let me put that in a bigger context for you. Right after Pearl Harbor, everything goes to hell in a handbasket for the Allies, right? There's lots of stuff going on out in the Western Pacific. Malaya is falling apart. Hong Kong gets captured. The Philippines are being dismembered. This is a really, really dark time. And for the U.S. Navy, with the majority of our battleships now sitting on the bottom at Pearl Harbor, we don't have what we think is a striking force that can actually, bring the war to the Japanese Navy. All we've got is, we got some carriers. So, and we know that Japan's carrier force, they have just demonstrated to us at Pearl Harbor that this is an exceptionally lethal, capable force that outnumbers ours. So we can't afford to get into a pitched battle with these guys right now. And so what we're doing is we are sending our carriers down to do raids around the perimeter of the Japanese Empire. And so the Marshall Islands, which is a huge archipelago, it's, well over 1,000 miles from end to end, contains a number of Japanese bases. And so what we're doing is we're poking the bear, and we're also getting some training reps in for our carrier groups and bringing them up to speed. So yeah, we're down here and doing one of these raids. I am not deep enough in the weeds to tell you whether or not that second airfield that was a surprise is... I think there's a little conflation going on with the dive bomber attack that Dick Best will be doing later on against the actual Japanese carrier force. And we can talk about that story when we get there. They're playing extremely fast and loose with Dick Best. Okay. The very first time we meet Dick Best in this movie, he's like, I'm going to try a dead stick landing on this carrier. I'm going to go in with, right, which is just utter baloney. That's another thing that take a shot.
You never know when you're going to need it, right?
Yes, you never know. With your backseater who didn't volunteer for this crap, bring her in, So they portray him as this sort of gum-chewing cowboy New Jersey guy, and Dick Best was like the antithesis of that. Dick Best was this consummate, button-down, by-the-book naval professional. So, and that was one of the things that, just from a character standpoint, I'm just like, what? What are you doing here, guys? But, and I wrote to the guy who actually did do the script checking on this movie. He's a friend of mine. And I was like, what was up with that? And my friend was like, I tried to bring that to the attention, and the director is like, I have to make Dick Best into this kind of a character if it's going to play on the screen, and so I've got to have him doing this kind of stuff. It's just like, okay.
You tried damage control. You tried, right?
Yeah, we tried. Didn't happen. So
if we go back to the movie, the next key plot point that happens is the Doolittle raid, April 18th, 1942. And the way that the movie explains this, it's being led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, hence the name, with Army bombers taking off from the carrier Hornet. Their plan is to bomb Tokyo and then land in China, but they end up having to take off a little bit sooner than expected. So we see them bombing Tokyo, but then they're forced to jump out of the planes without knowing where they're at. And as I was watching the movie to prepare for our chat, I couldn't help but notice that it seems like no one knows anything about the Doolittle raid before it happens. For example, Halsey is talking to another sailor. He calls Mr. Browning and explains the purpose of the raid as if he doesn't know what's going on. Or Dick Best talking about him on Enterprise, talking to other pilots. And then someone walks in and says, you've got to see this. And they go outside and they see the Army B-25s on Hornet. Like, they had no idea that they were even there. So there's a bit of a two-part question. Do you think the movie did a good job depicting the Doolittle raid on screen? And then is it true that the men on the ships had no idea before seeing the bombers on Hornet's deck?
Yeah. I mean, this operation was kept under very, very tight security because it's a one-time deal. The problem with a carrier raid using conventional carrier aircraft, these single-engine planes that we typically use, is you got to get really close to the Japanese home islands to do that, like within 200 miles or something like that, which is scary close. So the notion with using these B-25 bombers is they got a much longer range than a single engine fighter or bomber, and we can launch these puppies from 650, 700 miles off the Japanese coast. They can go in, do their thing, then they'll bingo over to China, land at airfields over there, and everything should be cool. Giving our very, very valuable aircraft carriers, of which we only have 3 or 4 in the Pacific at this time, the opportunity to then get the heck out of Dodge, right, before the retaliation comes in. what ends up happening is, they get close to Japan and they run into a couple of Japanese picket boats, fishing boats that they've equipped with a radio just for this purpose, to make sure that the Americans can't bring in a carrier raid. So the picket boats say, and, we know that they say, which means that it's time to launch, like right now, even though we are further away from Japan than we wanted to be. So we do that. We launch those B-25s and we get the heck out of Dodge. The actual, travel to Japan. Enterprise had been in and around Pearl Harbor. Hornet had come directly from the West Coast. Enterprise leaves Pearl Harbor, rendezvous with Hornet in the North Pacific, and then they go on their merry way towards Japan. So, a lot of those guys who were on Enterprise would have been like, the heck? What are we doing here? Why are the... I've never seen an Army bomber on an aircraft carrier before, and you never will again. That would have been an eye-opener. Halsey absolutely knew what was going on. Miles Browning, who's the guy he's talking to, absolutely would have known what was going on. But the rank and file on the carriers, in many cases, would be like absolutely dumbfounded.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense than them connecting together. Because when I saw that in the movie, I was like, okay, these ships have been right next to each other for all this time, and they didn't happen to look over and notice that. That doesn't
right. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on.
Okay. While in the movie, the Doolittle raid doesn't really seem to do a lot of damage itself, but we do see some brief scenes of Doolittle himself parachuting into China. And then when the Japanese attack, he asks what they're targeting because he's like, there's no military installations nearby. And the response that he gets is the Chinese people are the target. Is it true that the Chinese civilians were targeted by the Japanese military like the movie implies?
Horrifically. Okay, so... the Japanese are furious about this raid. And we can talk about the effects of it just in a second here. But to your point, they go in ex post facto into the Chinese hinterland where they think that these aviators have come down. They capture some of the American aviators. They kill something on the order of 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for this. Okay. Yeah. It's horrific.
Wow.
Yeah. So this war that's been going on in China since 1937 is incredibly brutal. And most Americans don't understand the magnitude of the death toll. The Chinese are going to lose between 15 and 22 million people killed in this war, as opposed to the 400,000 that the Americans lose between all theaters, European and Pacific. So that you can make an argument that Chinese lose more civilians in that one retaliation operation than we probably lost in the entire Pacific War.
Did the American public know about that retaliation at the time?
We didn't know the full magnitude of it. We were more focused on the fact that, some of those Doolittle aviators who were captured by the Japanese were then summarily executed back in Tokyo. And that, really set us off. And so, the American viewpoint is very Americanocentric throughout this war. And China was acknowledged as an ally, but the true magnitude of the death toll there was not super, even if it was known at a sort of a superficial level, it's hard to really internalize what that means. 250,000 people killed because of one raid. It's kind of nutty.
Well, you're talking about the effects of the raid, and even though there wasn't a lot of damage, the impression that I got was it was a great morale boost for Americans. But if they had known about that retaliation, maybe it wouldn't have had the same effect.
I think that yes, it was a huge shot in the arm for us because again, the war has been a dumpster fire up to this point, and there had been no good news coming out in the papers for months and months and months. By the time you get to April, MacArthur's command actually has just fallen in Bataan. Now Corregidor is besieged in Manila Harbor. That's going to fall in early May. Corregidor is besieged. Malaya has gone down in the dark. Burma is going down in the dark. All of Java, Sumatra, and all that stuff has been captured by the Japanese. It's just been a rout. And there's lots of stuff going bad in Europe for us too. Anyway, so this is a huge shot in the arm for the Americans to at least be able to say, this war isn't over, suckers. This is never going to be over until we say it's over, and we have got the power to still punch you in the eye and hit back. So that was a big deal. From the Japanese standpoint, you're right. The material effects of this raid are minimal. What can you do with 16 medium bombers? They sprinkle some bombs in desultory fashion over various cities and they go on their way. But it was a huge black eye for the Japanese military leadership, who were just absolutely mortified that the Americans could even do such a raid. And the fact that, some of these bombers were within spitting distance of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the emperor might have been in danger. That is just mortifying. There's a common misperception that the Doolittle raid led to Midway, and that's not true. Yamamoto had already fought and won the bureaucratic battle to do the Midway operation early in April. And Doolittle happens 2 weeks after that. But what happens there is, up until this point, the Japanese army is like, we don't want anything to do with this Midway operation. You guys, if you want to capture that island, y'all are going to have to supply your own troops to do it. When Doolittle goes down, suddenly the army does a complete 180, and they're like, yeah, maybe what you're saying about the fact that we're not going to be safe until these American carriers are put in their graves has some legitimacy to it. So here's a regiment of troops that you now can bring along on your Midway operation to take that island. And more importantly, we are now going to start amphibious training for 2 of our divisions, because eventually we know that your goal is to actually take Midway, but then move down the line of the Hawaiian Islands and go and capture Oahu. And so here are the divisions that are going to do that operation. That's really what Midway is intended to do, is being a stepping stone to go grab Oahu.
That makes a lot more sense as to why they even show that in movie about Midway to begin with. Because, I was thinking it was something. It was. I was under the perception that the raid had more to do with Midway itself.
Yeah, and this is the problem with movies as a visual medium and a storytelling, is you have to compress all this stuff into this. And if you introduce too many characters, of course, you just confuse the audience. And who's this guy again? So, yeah, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that they just can't get into because it would just confuse the hell out of everybody.
For sure. Makes sense. Speaking of the movie, there's another element before we actually get to the Battle of Midway. This is about halfway through the movie when we see the U.S. fleet in the Coral Sea, South Pacific, May 8th, 1942. We don't see any fighting here. There's just an American carrier that's on fire, surrounded by some other ships, presumably rescuing the sailors on the burning ship. And Halsey says something along the lines about how they got there 24 hours too late. We find out through some dialogue that there were only 2 American carriers left in the Pacific. But the movie doesn't really give a lot of context around what happened here. We see that the battle seems to have already happened. So can you fill in some historical details about what the movie is portraying here in the Coral Sea?
Right. So at this point, we got 4 carriers, and you can think of them as operating in 2 pairs. Halsey's got the northern pair, that's Enterprise and Hornet, which are doing the Doolittle raid. The southern pair that's down in Coral Sea near Australia is the Yorktown and the Lexington under a guy named Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher doesn't even appear in the movie. And this, again, is a case of I can't introduce too many characters into my movie. Halsey was never at the Battle of Coral Sea. Okay, he never saw any of that stuff.
Take another shot here.
Take another shot, right? Halsey was moving south. He was trying to get down to Coral Sea because Admiral Nimitz, his boss back in Pearl, is like, there's going to be a carrier battle being fought down here. I want you to get down there as rapidly as possible. But they missed that battle. Okay, so there's a Japanese invasion force that wants to capture a town on the southern coast of New Guinea called Port Moresby. And I'm not even going to go into the details as to why the hell they wanted it. It was stupid that they wanted it, but they wanted it. So they're sending an invasion fleet down there, and they send a pair of aircraft carriers, which had been at Pearl Harbor, but now they're down in the South Pacific, Shokaku and Zuikaku. And we end up having a carrier battle. It's the very first carrier battle in history, and nobody knows what they're doing. So So there's a lot of, blind man's bluff and just kind of groping around in the dark for each other and terrible sighting reports. Understand, this whole thing is happening like how many years after the Wright brothers' first flight? It isn't a lot. So navigating over open water at this point in time, I mean, nowadays, right? You and I can't go to the grocery store without Siri whispering in our ear and telling us where the hell to go, right? Back in those days, flying a plane off of an aircraft carrier, you got a crappy little paper map that's big enough you can strap it to your leg. I've got a compass. I've got a pencil. I've got my instrument dashboard stuff. That's how I'm navigating. So in a lot of cases, I don't even know where the hell I am, let alone if I see some ships out there. One, do I know where I am? Can I estimate where they are? What's their course? What's their speed? What are they? All I see is these wakes. Maybe I get closer and it's a big blob. Yeah, it looks like that's an aircraft carrier when it might actually be a tanker or something. So there's just a lot of miscues on both sides as they're trying to do this thing. Anyway, the second morning of the battle, both forces know that have their opposite numbers out there. Both sides find each other. Both sides put up strikes. We put a hurting on the Japanese. Shokaku takes some bomb hits and damn near sinks and has to skedaddle back to Japan. Zuikaku, her sister, gets her air group shot to pieces. So meanwhile, Lexington takes a couple torpedoes, a couple of bombs. She looks like she's doing okay for a while, but then there are these big fires that break out on her and she burns to the waterline. So that's what you're seeing here in the movie is survivors being taken off of Lexington. Yorktown, meanwhile, as you'll note, takes a bomb through her flight deck and also takes a bunch of near misses that kind of pop the seams in her fuel tanks and stuff. And so, she's kind of hurt as a result of this battle as well. From a tactical standpoint, the Americans lose this battle in that we lose a great big aircraft carrier, the Lexington, and we only sink a small one. There's this other little carrier called Shoho that gets sunk in the battle. But from an operational and strategic standpoint, it's a victory for us in that it forestalls this Japanese invasion and actually, for the first time in the war, actually turns around a Japanese invasion force. We sort of, that was a big deal. But that's now the situation on the eve of the Battle of Midway, that I've still got Hornet and Enterprise in undamaged condition. Lexington is gone. Yorktown is damaged. There's another carrier out on the West Coast, Saratoga, which is also damaged and out of the picture. So now Nimitz is in the middle of May, gets the first intimations from Rochefort and the Codebreakers that, looks like there's another operation shaping up in the Central Pacific somewhere close to home. And now Nimitz has got to scramble, pull what assets he can back to Pearl Harbor in time, throw together a battle plan, and that's going to end up being the Battle of Midway.
Okay, so now that I know more about the history, the movie makes a lot more sense as to why they don't show what's going on, because that part of it doesn't seem as relevant to Midway as much as who are the players and the different ships that we have, and that was affected then by that battle. So I understand the filmmaker's decision on that. It just, when I was watching, I was like, this doesn't make sense. What's going on?
Yeah, it's really hard. You can think of this Midway movie in a sense as this is the story of USS Enterprise in the Battle of Midway, because Yorktown barely even features. Yorktown's commander, Admiral Fletcher, he doesn't even feature. And yet he is the commander at Midway. Spruance is going to be his subordinate. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But again, for the purposes of their storytelling, they're cutting away the extraneous stuff, and you're left basically with the cast that's on the carrier Enterprise and what they're doing in this movie or during this battle. That becomes essentially the proxy for the entire battle.
Well, if we are to believe the movie's version of events, it seems like everyone seems to know that the Japanese are planning an attack. And earlier we talked about Leighton and the intelligence for Pearl Harbor and that aspect of it. But that's starting to come into play now for the Battle of Midway. they know that there's an attack coming at a major target, but they don't know where it is. And there's this code name of AF that seems to be floating around. Leighton and Rochefort think that it's Midway, but Washington, D.C. does not. And then a little later, we find that Leighton tells Nimitz, this is all in the movie, that they intercepted a Japanese message saying the water plant on AF is broken. It seems that Midway accidentally sent out an unencrypted transmission of their water plant being broken down. Of course, it wasn't broken. It wasn't an accident, right? They were sending the message was not an accident, unencrypted. But is that really how the U.S. Navy figured out that Midway was the target?
Yes and no. 80% of that is correct. So there's a fight going on now between Rochefort and his crew at Hypo, which is the code-breaking station in Pearl, and their bosses back in Washington, D.C., at a place called Op 20G. Op 20G is run by a couple of sort of nefarious characters. They're going to be the bad guys in this drama later in the war. They're going to get Rochefort fired, and all of the nerderati like me. We hate the Redmond brothers. But anyway, so there's this feud going on, and Washington is saying AF is not Midway. AF is up in the Aleutian Islands, or AF is down close to Australia, but we don't buy that it's Midway. Meanwhile, Rochefort and Leighton and all of their guys is like, y'all are smoking crack. We absolutely know that AF is Midway, and they had laid out all the reasons to both Leighton and Nimitz was convinced as well. So finally, what they end up doing is, yes, there's a secure underwater cable that runs up to Midway. And so they send a message up to Midway that they know the Japanese can't intercept. And they tell Midway, I want you to broadcast in clear that your water purification plant has broken down. And that's what Midway does. And then, like within a day, lo and behold, they intercept a Japanese message that says, AF is short of water. Send a water tanker along with the invasion force when we do our thing. So really, what that little sequence does is allows Hypo to go back to Washington and say, see, we told you, to settle that debate. The other big debate that's going on that they don't talk about at all in the movie is the status of the carrier Zuikaku, which had been, her air group had been shot up in Coral Sea. She gets back to Japan. The Japanese, if they had wanted to, probably could put together some sort of a composite air group on her. Some of the Shokaku survivors and her survivors and whatever, got enough airplanes that could have been credible, and they could have brought her along to Midway as well, which would have meant that the Japanese would have brought 5 carriers to the party. That's what Op 20G back in DC thinks is going to happen. Meanwhile, Hypo is like, nah, we think they're only bringing 4. So there's an ongoing debate between these two that lasts up until May 30th or so, right on the eve of the battle, and when they finally get that figured out. So that then plays into how is Nimitz going to craft his battle plan? I think this is another one of the questions you wanted to get into. It's just,
there's a scene in the movie where we see that happening. Nimitz is explaining the American battle plan for Midway. According to the way the movie shows it, Halsey is in the hospital with shingles, so Admiral Spruance is given command of his task force. There's a plan to set up a trap. Carriers are going to be on the northeast of Midway. There's a line of subs, and we can see the movie shows like one of those big maps that you always see in the movies, right, where they're moving pieces around. We can see visually there's 4 subs in the map in front of Nimitz. And he says that they've crammed every single plane that they can spare into the runway at Midway. And surprisingly, there's another, we didn't really talk too much about this part of the movie, but we see, Yorktown having this huge hole blown in the deck. Nimitz goes there as it's being repaired. He's like, we need to have it fixed in 72 hours, I think he said. And it ends up being fixed in time to join the fight. And we'll talk about the battle itself in a moment, but how well do you think the movie did setting up that battle?
That's fairly legit. There's a lot of uncertainty on Nimitz's part about the status of Yorktown, particularly because, he knows that the Japanese could potentially bring 5 aircraft carriers to this fight. He is already determined, even before Yorktown makes it back to Pearl Harbor on May 27th, and the battle is going to be fought on June 4th. So, we're talking really tight timetables here. He's determined that even if Yorktown can't be repaired, I'm still going to fight this battle with 2 carriers. Which, when you look at that, that's pretty ballsy. Some of this is driven by a doctrine. I actually just wrote a big article on this in the last couple of years for the Naval War College Review, because that battle plan has never really been properly understood. And this is one of those things that sort of tweaked my interest too, that Nimitz was willing to fight that battle even at odds of 2 carriers versus 5, which is just heart-stopping. I mean, what are you thinking, my man? But part of what's going on there is that Nimitz actually would have kept his carriers further away from Midway, and he would have let those submarines and the air group on Midway do their thing first, okay? And we'll assess, have those assets been sufficiently lethal enough to sink 1 or 2 of the Japanese carriers? Then and only then would I give the word to my carriers northeast of Midway, okay, it looks like the odds are a little more even. Why don't you come on down? Because they're well out of scouting range from the Japanese. That's not historically what ends up happening. What ends up happening is Yorktown comes back to Pearl Harbor on the 27th. The Americans have had no problems patching up the flight deck. That's not the big issue. The issue is that I'm leaking oil and I've got internal damage in the ship. But by the time Fletcher, who's the actual admiral in charge of this operation, who gets lost to history. Everybody thinks, yeah, Admiral Spruance won the Battle of Midway. It's like he was Fletcher's subordinate. Anyway, Fletcher gets back to Pearl. He's like, I think we can probably patch her up in time. But they do, they swarm her. They put 1,500 workers on board this ship for 72 hours and just work like crazy to just, patch her up, get her sufficiently seaworthy that she's not leaking oil anymore, and we can at least get up to 27 knots or something like that. And then they turn her around and they get her out on the 30th of May, and she hustles up to Midway. On the 2nd of June, so now we're 2 days before the battle, she shows up on station. Hornet and Enterprise are already there. And at that point in time, Nimitz then is like, okay, I now have 3 carriers on station. And we've also finally settled the debate where we know Zuikaku is not coming to the party. So I know the Japanese are bringing 4 carriers. Now I'm feeling a little more safe, and I'm willing to dial up the risk-o-meter a little bit. And so he sends a radio message to Fletcher that night, and he suggests to Fletcher that it might be advantageous if you moved your forces 175 miles to the west, i.e. closer to Midway and closer to where we think the Japanese are going to show up. Because now I'm willing to fight this battle all on a single day. Whereas, before I was going to wait the first day, let the Midway Air Group do their thing. Anyway, he's compressing this time frame. Fletcher, being nobody's fool, understands that suggestions from 4-star admirals are to be taken relatively seriously, and he very expeditiously, moves his forces over there that night, and that's what leads to the battle that we see unfolding on 4 June.
It's suggestion. I like it.
Yeah.
There is a fun bit of dialogue in the movie I want to ask you about. Leighton, when he's asked about the reliability of his intelligence about the coming attack by Admiral Spruance, asks him that in the room, and Leighton doesn't want to give too many details, which makes sense because he's kind of predicting things and no one can really predict the future. But when Spruance presses for details, Leighton says, the Japanese will attack on the morning of June 4th from the northwest with a bearing of 325 degrees. They'll be sighted 175 miles from Midway at 0700 local time. And then after the attack happens in the movie, we'll talk about the attack here, but after that happens, Nimitz says, well, Leighton, you were only 5 minutes, 5 miles, and 5 degrees off, which Leighton's like, I'll try to do better in the future, right? Was the movie right about those details, though?
Yeah, that's essentially right on the money. And yeah, you can quibble a little bit about the 5 miles, 5 degrees, but it's very, very close. Again, given the difficulties in maneuvering these forces and predicting where people are going to be, we're playing blind man's bluff, right? And so back in 42, just getting two carrier forces within proximity to each other so they could actually have a battle was sort of like a minor miracle. Leighton's prediction was very, very good.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely seems like something that a little bit of luck, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of work for sure. I don't want to minimize that by any means, but just from what you're saying about intelligence and just the sheer amount of data, there's got to be an element of luck to it.
Yeah, there was some luck there, but yeah, he made a good guess, and it turned out to be pretty much right on the money.
Nice. Well, we have talked about the lead up so far, and it's finally time for the Battle of Midway itself in the movie. And the way the movie explains the battle is it uses some text on the screen to explain different things. So I thought I would highlight those to kind of give an overview of the movie's depiction of the battle. First, of course, it mentions all of this happening June 4th, 1942. At 6:40 a.m., we can see planes in the air from the Japanese carrier air group doing a bombing run on Midway. They blow up the airfield and runway. At 7:10 a.m., we see Midway Island Air Group attacking the Japanese ships. The movie doesn't really show them doing a good job. One of the Japanese officers says something about how their glide bombing calls the American pilots amateurs. 7:45 a.m., we see submarine USS Nautilus at 250 miles northwest of Midway as it encounters a Japanese fleet, tries to find the carriers. At 9:38 a.m., more American planes, this time from Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6, attack the Japanese ships. But again, they don't seem to do much damage. The time changes then to 9:55 a.m. Hornet Torpedo Squadron 8. We see Dick Best and Wade McCluskey's dive bombers each making hits on different Japanese carriers, leaving them burning. At 4:30 p.m., battleship Yamamoto, some 600 miles west of Midway, the movie says, Japanese get a message from Admiral Nagumo, I believe it was, to let them know that the fires are raging on Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi. At 4:56 p.m., the U.S. Combined Air Group goes back out to try to attack the last Japanese carrier. And again, it's Dick Best who drops the bomb in the middle of the deck for that ship before just barely making it back to his own carrier. And his training from earlier seemed to come into play there.
Didn't happen.
And then finally, Admiral Spruance gives the order to withdraw for the night. He says they've won a great victory, but without knowing what the Japanese will do next, he doesn't want to blow it. So I know that's a lot. That's kind of the outline from the text screens in the movie. Is that a good essence of the Battle of Midway?
Yeah, you've just given the Cliff Notes version. And yeah, most of that is straight up legit. They've obviously left, we're conflating, again, the experience of Enterprise with all of the other ships that were there. So, where do I want to start? These two sort of simultaneous attacks that happen in the early morning, Midway getting clobbered and the Americans going after the Japanese carrier force. Of course, there had to be spotting reports before that would give the Americans the indication that, lo and behold, there are Japanese ships here that we ought to go after. But yes, there is a group of planes that flies out from Midway and attacks at 0700, and they get just absolutely chopped to pieces because the Japanese Zero pilots really know their business, and the Zero is a great fighter. And yeah, I knew one of the guys, one of the few survivors from that particular sortie. And he was a 17-year-old kid when he went out, and he was a changed human being when he comes back. He had a baseball cap that had a hole in the, he let me put my finger through it. That was where the machine gun bullet from a Japanese Zero came in and creased his head, knocked him cold. He comes to, he's lying in a pool of blood from the gunner above him who's been killed. And, the plane has been shot to pieces. The pilot up front in this TBF Avenger is like, I don't know how I'm going to keep this bird in the air. And finally, when they're down almost at sea level, he finally realizes that my hydraulics are gone, but my trim tabs are still working. And if I use those, that gives us enough extra lift that we can, make our way back to Midway and land in, this Swiss cheese looking airplane. Anyway, there's another series of attacks that actually elicits that comment from Nagumo's men that, these planes are using glide bombing attacks. If you're a dive bomber pilot, the real pros come in literally vertical, 80, 75, 85, 90 degrees down on to a ship. If you're not such a good dive bomber pilot, you come in at 35 degrees and you try to, do one of these things where you sort of pull up and loft your bomb and hopefully the bomb lands on the target. It never works for crap. That's what ended up happening at around 8:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning. So they're again conflating two separate American attacks, but that's the gist of it. Our aviators on Midway can't do beams. They just get shot to pieces and they don't do anything to the Japanese. As far as the torpedo plane attacks are concerned, yes, VT-6 is the torpedo squadron on Enterprise. It was actually VT-8 that came in first and gets annihilated. That's at 09:17 in the morning. 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, only one guy left alive in the water. I mean, it's brutal. And no hits against the Japanese. VT-6 comes in about 20 minutes later, not quite annihilated. I mean, that's about the best you can say. I think they bring 3 of their planes home. It's bad, really, really bad. But what's happening during this entire time is that Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese carrier fleet, is now aware that there are American carriers out here. He finally got a sighting report. And he wants to put in a counterattack against us. But because his flight decks are constantly sending up Zero fighters to protect his fleet and bring those fighters back down when they're running low on ammunition. So he's cycling combat air patrol fighters this entire time, which means that he doesn't have the necessary 40-minute window to put up his own strike force on his flight deck, get their engines warmed up, and get them ready to rock and roll, and go off and hit us. He's leaking time, is what it comes down to. And so then, as you say, 9:55, 10 o'clock, something like that, lo and behold, 2 different groups of dive bombers from 2 different carriers, Yorktown and Enterprise. Our brave boys, Dick Best and the gang from Enterprise, are coming in from the southwest. Yorktown's group is coming in from the southeast. They don't even know that each other is there. They end up sighting the Japanese carriers at roughly the same time, and they're approaching from 2 different vectors. And understand that this is in the days before radar. We've got radar, the Japanese don't. There's broken cloud cover, so it's difficult to detect planes coming in at high altitude. And so the Japanese air patrol arrangements just break down catastrophically at this point. A lot of those planes are dealing with torpedo attacks that are happening elsewhere around the perimeter of the fleet. These dive bombers are coming in. Nobody even sees them. And at 10:22, both of these groups of aircraft start doing their thing. And that's what we end up seeing.
The impression that I got, you talking about, kind of bleeding time there, the impression I got from the movie was that some of the losses that the Americans had in the beginning were basically the reason why the Japanese had to keep their planes up in the air against them. Is there any truth to that?
Okay, so this is one of the most long-standing myths about the Battle of Midway, is that, okay, the sacrifice of those torpedo planes was horrific, but it played this big role in that it pulled the Japanese Zeros down to sea level, and that leaves the skies clear for the American dive bombers to come in at high level. That's kind of nonsense, because if you look at the performance characteristics of a Japanese Zero, this is a plane that can climb from sea level up to 15,000 feet in like 7 minutes flat. Okay? It's a zippy little plane. And so Torpedo Squadron 8, which attacked at 09:17, was completely destroyed by about 09:30, 09:35. In other words, 50 minutes before this dive bomber attack happens. Same thing with VT-6. VT-6 comes in at around 9:40 and is destroyed by 10. So the Japanese had plenty of time to get those Zeros back up in the air and at the altitudes that they would want to have been operating at to intercept dive bombers. It's the final attack by Yorktown, who also have a squadron of torpedo planes in them. That's VT-3. I know we're going into the weeds here, but what happens is VT-3 approaches from the southwest at medium altitude, and they are detected by the Japanese. And basically all of the zeros kind of get sucked into the southeast threat vector. They can see these torpedo planes, and that's an obvious threat. I haven't seen the dive bombers yet. And so it's not a case of vertical not being in the right place vertically. It's that they have been laterally distorted and pulled away from the fleet, thereby leaving the other axes of attack open to the Americans. So that's what's going on there.
Okay. Which makes a lot of sense, knowing that the Japanese don't have radar. This is, you see the enemy visually, and okay, that makes sense.
Well, and unfortunately, one of the things that the movie sort of portrays, and again, this is back in the sort of the Star Wars canon, there's a lot of planes coming in like Dick Best at relatively low level, which is not what dive bombers do. And you see them like literally popping up over Japanese warships on their way to it's like this entire fleet there are only 20 Japanese warships here, and they are incredibly spread out. Because we don't have radar, what they've done is they've taken a lot of the destroyers and they've pushed them way out to the visual horizon almost. And so if that destroyer sees something coming in, it'll start firing its guns. And then the people, back in the core of the fleet, the carriers are like, uh-oh, Bubba over there is shooting its guns. Maybe we ought to send some Zeros over in that neck of the woods. That's their air defense arrangements. It's pretty pathetic. But in the course of coming into an attack on this fleet, man, you'd have been lucky if you'd have found one Japanese ship to pop over, let alone, ship after ship after ship. They make it out to be this enormous formation of dozens of ships. It ain't that big. The other thing, of course, dive bombers, they like to dive. And so they don't want to come in at, sea level. We want to be coming in at 15,000 feet. We're going to do a gradual descent to build up some airspeed. And then when we get over our target, boom, now we go down at 90 degrees and we nail them. So that's what we should have seen, but didn't.
Yeah. At the very end of the movie, there are some text that explains what happens to the real people. And we don't go through all of that. But that reminds me of actually some text at the very beginning of the movie that I want to ask you about here at the end. And the quote at the beginning of the movie is, I'll quote it here, it says, "This is a true account of the events that led to the most important naval battle in American history. One single day that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific." Now, since the movie ends after the battle itself, the victory for the Americans, it doesn't really talk about the overall context of how it turned the tide. So can you give us a summary of how the Battle of Midway turned the tide of the war in the Pacific?
Right. And so this is a weird thing for a guy who wrote about a book on the Battle of Midway to say, but I don't believe in turning points in a war this large. Okay. I believe in inflection points that will nudge a war onto a slightly new course, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the course of this war. I absolutely do think that the Battle of Midway is the most important naval battle history in U.S. history. It's certainly the most important naval battle in World War II, but it's not because of what it does right then and there. It's what it does bigger picture. So let me explain. Again, the war is a dumpster fire. And by the time, though, we get to the middle of 1942, the productive spigots back in the U.S. are starting to turn on, and we've got this enormous shipbuilding program that we know is going to bear fruit, starting in mid-1943. The problem for us right now is that we're not in daily contact with the Japanese. And so the war had been episodic for us. The Philippines, there had been some ground combat there, but that's all done now. Corregidor has finally fallen. That whole garrison has gone into captivity. We've done some carrier raids around the perimeter. We've fought a couple carrier battles now. But if you're thinking big picture, if I'm the United States, I know that long term, I have got it all over the Japanese. I have twice the population. I am completely self-sufficient in oil, coal, steel, anything you care to name. I have a massive industrial advantage on the Japanese. But the only way this war is going to end is for me to somehow crush their military forces, get my own military forces within proximity to the home islands. I got to capture some island bastions out there someplace where I'm either going to bomb the Japanese into ruin or physically invade them. So there's an attritional process that has to start here. I think in terms of a sausage grinder, that every day somewhere in the Pacific, I need to be rolling out of bed every morning knowing it's going to be a great day because today I am going to be killing Japanese soldiers, shooting down their aircraft, hopefully getting in a naval battle every so often, and just starting this attritional process to destroy their military so that I can advance in the Pacific and do the things that I need to do. I ain't got that now. Midway gives us that. Because what ends up happening as a result of Midway, so the Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers, all 4 that went to that party. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, gone. The 4 best aircraft carriers they had. And we only lose the Yorktown. So now by hook or by crook, what's happened is we have dragged ourselves back up to parity with the Japanese in terms of carrier power. Which doesn't sound all that thrilling, but in the dark days of 1942, that's a hell of a great accomplishment. And this allows Nimitz's boss, Admiral King, who runs the U.S. Navy back in Washington, to start thinking about, where do I want to counterattack? I want to take the initiative away from these guys. And what that ends up creating within the next 2 months is a campaign down at this heretofore unknown island called Guadalcanal. And we're going to be invading Guadalcanal in early August. That's going to kick off a 6-month campaign. And during the course of that campaign, we're going to kill 30 to 40,000 Japanese soldiers on that island. We're going to probably shoot down 600 or 700 of their aircraft. There's going to be 6 major naval battles in the course of that contest that are going to sink 24 Japanese warships, 24 of ours too. That's the sausage grinder that we need to start this process. And our victory at Midway gives us the ability to speed up that timetable. If we had lost at Midway, I don't think we're going to lose the war, but we ain't going to get no sausage grinder set up, on August 7th, 1942 at Guadalcanal, right? So Midway is sort of it's the gift that keeps on giving. It allows us to change the parameters of the war sufficiently that we can now create the kind of war that we need as the bigger, heavier, opponent in this thing to start giving it to the Japanese and getting the attritional process going.
It sounds like it's similar to what you're talking about with the intelligence. Like, okay, looking at it now, looking at the past now, we can see that these are the points that picked out Pearl, right? And it sounds like that's almost the same case with Midway. It's like, okay, now we can look back and say, this allowed us to be more offensive, go on the offensive. This was the point. If we had lost at Midway, then maybe it would have been a different point. But because we're looking at it from our perspective now, we can see that that's when the tide turned.
And it's interesting too, because at the time, if you go back and read the newspaper headlines of the New York Times right around June 7th, June 8th, after this battle was just concluded, yes, they recognize that it's an important victory, but there are a lot of people that are saying, the Japanese are going to be back, and they're going to come back in even stronger numbers this next time. So nobody at this point in June 42 recognizes this for what we're going to call it 80 years later. Seminal battle, game changer. It's just not obvious. Because again, the war is going so badly in so many other areas. There's even editorial 3 weeks after the battle. This comes out in the New York Times as well. And understand that normally the New York Times is very friendly to FDR. But they make the point in this editorial that the war is so big and so complex and not going very well that FDR is not capable of running this war as supreme commander, and he should turn his job over to another appointed military man, maybe like MacArthur. So that gives you a bellwether as just what the mood in the country is at this point. The stock market is in the pits. There are a lot of people that are looking around even after this victory in mid-June and going, I don't know how this thing is going to turn out. It's a scary time.
Throughout the movie, there were a lot of things that made me question what might have been. Are you open to maybe doing some what-if scenarios?
Bring it on.
Okay. The first one, you might have already kind of started to answer that one there, but the biggest what if is we're talking about the tide of the war and how everything changed. What if the Americans had not won the Battle of Midway? How do you think that would have affected the overall war?
Yeah, and we have to sort of couch our terms, what does not win look like? I don't think that there's any scenario where we lose all three of our carriers. I think that both Fletcher and Spruance were cautious enough that they would have seen that if things are going pear-shaped, they would have headed for the exits and probably brought out at least one of our carriers. That's a guess, who knows? But again, going back big picture, and likewise, I don't see that there's any way that the Japanese don't lose some of their carriers in return. So I think the sort of the worst case scenario that you come away with this battle is the Japanese lose two, we lose two. Maybe they successfully invade the island, although I really don't think they could have, and we could nerd out on that if need be. But the bottom line is, again, big picture, the U.S. has an economy that is 5 times larger than Japan's. At the start of the war, it's going to be 8 times larger by the time we get to the end of this war. So I don't see, within the limited context of the Pacific, as long as the American political will to stay in this war is there, we are going to beat the Japanese. I just don't know when. And you can fast forward, though, to all sorts of nightmare scenarios where, okay, if we're not as fast getting to where we got by the middle of 1945, the Russians might have invaded the northern part of Japan, and we could have come out of that war with a communist occupation zone and an allied occupation. You could have had North and South Japan, just like you have North and South Korea. So there's all sorts of... The further you get away from the battle, these ripples of cause and effect get more and more nebulous, and I don't have a big enough crystal ball. All I will say, again, is that Midway is incredibly important in allowing us to start that attritional process a lot earlier than we would have otherwise.
It makes me wonder if the Japanese would have used that to their advantage, knowing that there's this, a war of attrition, essentially, and they're like, okay, we don't need to necessarily wait out the might of the American military, but we need to wait out the American public and their will to keep this war going.
No, there's a credible line of argument that instead of precipitating an operation in the Central Pacific in the middle of 1942, the Japanese, having grabbed all the stuff that they went to war for in the first place, which really is the oil down in Sumatra and Java, the tin, the rubber, the manganese, all of the stuff that they needed to become economically self-sufficient was not in the Central Pacific. It's all out in the South. Having done that by end of March, call it, start digging in, start preparing to defend, replenish your carrier groups, bring new carriers online, and just let the Americans come at you and try to bleed them when they hit your outer fences. The problem from the Japanese standpoint is, man, if you're playing football, the last thing you ever want to do is like, okay, here's your football. Please come at us at the time and place of your choosing. You never want to give away the momentum, right? I've got the momentum. So I want to keep hitting the Americans someplace and hopefully get their morale to cave in. The problem for the Japanese, though, is having attacked at Pearl Harbor the way they did attack, everyone in America is just furious and absolutely disinclined to negotiate with them. You really don't see war fatigue starting to happen on the American side until later in 1945. Then it's really kind of dicey then. By the time you win the war in Europe in May of 45, there are a lot of people who are just like, can we just get this thing over with, please? And there's a real sense of unease between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy at that point. The Navy does not want to see a lot of casualties at the end of this thing. The U.S. Army, on the other hand, is like, the longer this puppy goes, the more and more tired of it people are going to be. We need to bring this thing to a close. So that's fast forwarding. Anyway, there you have it. Yep.
The next what if that I have about Midway has to do with Yorktown, actually. And there's a line of dialogue I want to point out from the movie is between Dick Best and Clarence Dickinson. Mentioned when Yorktown catches up to the rest of the fleet, says, "Oh, we can't believe that she made it out of dry dock in time." And then Clarence says something along the lines of, "Every battle needs a miracle, right?" So what if Yorktown was not repaired in time for the Battle of Midway? Was it a miracle like the movie seems to suggest?
No, I don't think so. And as I say, Nimitz was willing to fight that battle at odds of 2 versus 4. So from a doctrinal standpoint, we're going to tank into the weeds here. The doctrine of the time said your average dive bomber will get 1 hit out of 6. So if I have a squadron of dive bombers of 18 aircraft, if they attack an enemy carrier, I should get 3 hits out of that. And 3 hits against an enemy carrier, that's either going to, disable it or sink it. So then understand that each one of our aircraft carriers carries 2 squadrons of dive bombers, not to mention the torpedo planes, which we think are kind of junky, but we don't really know until the battle just how junky they really are. But you can understand that if Nimitz is saying, I got 2 carriers, that means I got 4 dive bomber squadrons, which means if I can attack first, and that's the key, that's the nub of the matter, if I can get my attacks in first, there's no reason to think that if I can deliver a coordinated attack with those 2 carriers, I can't sink all 4 aircraft carriers of the Japanese at one go. That's why he's willing to offer battle. So, one of the things Tony and I were trying to push back on with our book at a larger picture is that the 2 most famous and best-selling books on this battle remain Incredible Victory by Walter Lord and Gordon Prang's Miracle at Midway. And the very titles suggest that very thing. It took an act of God for us to win this battle. But what Tony and I are saying is if you look at the tip of the spear, you see that Nagumo comes into this fight with 4 aircraft carriers, 20 warships. We come into this fight with 3 aircraft carriers, 20-odd warships, and the island of Midway, which can't be sunk, okay, and way more scouting assets in the form of float planes and that sort of thing, amphibious planes like PBY Catalinas down at Midway. Because again, if the key of the matter is I want to attack effectively first, that puts a big value on who's going to get the scouting reports in first. If you win the scouting battle, that means hopefully you get your aircraft up first before the Japanese do. And that is, in essence, what happened during the battle. And actually, that puts me in mind. One of the things I did want to talk about with this movie that I was pleased about, if you look at the actual dive bomber attack itself, the Japanese story had always been that at the time of that dive bomber attack at 10:22 in the morning, we were this close, baby. We had our planes lined up on the flight deck and they were ready to go. And then we were just minutes away from launching this lights out counterattack against the Americans. And then, oh my God, your dive bombers came down and snatched it all away from us. That was a myth that was put up by a guy named Mitsuo Fuchida. He was the flight leader at Pearl Harbor, interestingly. And he wrote a book right after the war called Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. And he lied about what happened on the flight decks. And a lot of what Tony in my book talks about is why it was, for these reasons of I'm constantly cycling all these combat air patrol fighters up all morning long. I never had that opportunity to put those strike birds up on my flight deck. So at the time of the actual dive bomber attack, there were no strike planes on those Japanese carrier decks. And that's what you see in the movie too. That when you're going down on the Japanese carriers, yeah, there's a few zeros here and there, but there aren't any torpedo planes or dive bombers or that kind of stuff. And so from my standpoint, trying to move the ball forward and stick a pin in that myth, the movie did that for me, and I was super happy about that.
Well, that leads right into what my final little what if scenario is, and that's with Admiral Nagumo talking about how after the American bombers attack the Japanese ships, he orders the planes on the carriers to be rearmed with torpedoes to bombs instead of, attack the land instead of the ships. And of course, that ends up being a problem. I've talked about kind of bleeding the time, and the American task force ends up being nearby. What if Nagumo hadn't rearmed his planes? Would that have affected the Japanese response to the American fleet?
There's a lot of debate about that too, on both sides of the pond. We don't know a lot about what was actually going on down in the hangars of the Japanese carriers and what the status of their arming or rearming. Were they even armed in the first place? I don't know. I think that Nagumo's decision is understandable. And so for the sake of our audience here, what ends up happening is the morning strike against the island of Midway goes in at 0640. The strike leader at 0700 then radios back to Nagumo and says, this place ain't been put out of business. We need to hit it again. At the same time this is going on, that initial strike of planes, American planes from Midway comes in. It's ineffectual, but now Nagumo knows that he has been detected. And so he's got half of his aircraft still sitting down in his hangars, and he makes the decision, okay, I want to rearm those and prepare them for a second attack against Midway. A lot of people pillory him for that decision. They say exactly what you say. Why didn't you just leave your torpedoes on your planes? But from his standpoint, he has not detected any American ships in the neighborhood. The intel report that he comes into this battle tells him there's not going to be a naval fight this morning. We're not expecting any American carriers to be there. So is he obligated now to fight this battle perennially with one hand tied behind his back? Should I just keep that reserve strike always in my hangars, armed for ships that may not ever be there? From an operational tempo standpoint, I want to be hitting the Americans as rapidly as possible. If I'm trying to put this airbase out of business so that I can invade this place tomorrow or the next day, it makes sense for me to hit them with as many available aircraft as I can. Ever since human beings have started sharpening sticks, we've understood that there's no kill like overkill. You always want to be coming in with way more assets than you need because that lowers your own casualties. And so Nagumo ends up making what I think is a very comprehensible decision given the information he had in hand, which is hit Midway again as rapidly as possible. So he gives that order at 07:15. Okay, let's rearm. And lo and behold, it's only then 30 minutes later that one of his scout planes comes back and says, hold the phone, there's an American force here. And now they're like, we got to switch some of our aircraft back to torpedoes again. It's a big kerfuffle. And then the American attacks start coming in constantly, and they never had the opportunity to get that strike off.
It sounds like just another example of what we talked about with the intelligence and then the Battle of Midway itself. It's looking at it from our perspective right now. Bingo. We know that is the wrong decision to make, but in the moment, you don't have all the same information that you have after everything is over.
That's exactly right. Yeah, given the very skimpy data set that he has to operate on, standing in this fishbowl of a bridge on the Akagi, being constantly attacked by American aircraft, he's got to make these decisions. He's got to make them pretty quickly. We don't have the luxury of sitting back in our armchair. Well, obviously, it's not that kind of a thing. So, yeah, we have some sympathy for Nagumo. I don't think that he was a great leader. I don't think that he understood the carrier as a weapons system as well as some of his staff officers. But given the skimpiness of the carrier playbook at this point, again, nobody really knows how these battles get fought. And given the information he had at hand at the time, that was kind of the best decision he could have made, I think.
Well, thank you again so much for coming on to chat about Midway.
This is great fun.
For anyone listening to this who wants to learn more about the true story, I'll make sure to include a link to your book, Shattered Sword, Untold Story of the Battle of Midway. But before I let you go, can you share one of your favorite stories from the book that we just don't see in the movie?
Yeah, so this is alluded to. Spruance makes that comment late in the day. Yorktown has been knocked out at this point. His boss, Jack Fletcher, is sort of keeping track of Yorktown and trying to salvage her. So Spruance at the end of the day is really kind of running this battle. He has asked Fletcher for what his instructions are, and Fletcher very graciously has told him, I will conform to your movements. In other words, you're doing a great job. Keep it up. So by about 6 p.m. at the end of the movie, Spruance knows that we've knocked out 4 carriers. There may still be a 5th one out there, maybe. But his biggest concern is, what happens if the Japanese decide tonight to send their surface forces further to the east? What if they come gunning for me? You know? And an aggressive admiral would have positioned himself, he would have closed with the enemy so that when dawn comes tomorrow morning, I'm going to be closer to these retreating Japanese forces. I can just pound them all day long. What if they are coming and gunning for me tonight? You know, I don't want to get into a surface fight. The Japanese have got a pair of battleships in this force too, and they've got cruisers. And by this point in time, people are like, these guys seem pretty good at night combat. And so Spruance ends up making the decision, nope, I'm going to hold these dudes at arm's length. I'm going to back off. And some of his officers are kind of like, are you sure about that? And he's like, yeah, I'm sure, because my boss, Admiral Nimitz, has told me, do not do anything unless you think that you can do disproportionate damage to the enemy. We have to fight this battle on the principle of calculated risk. And Spruance very correctly gauges that there's nothing I can do tonight that is worth the risk of potentially losing this battle that we pretty much got in the bag. So 6 p.m. or 8 p.m., he gives his orders. They start pulling off to the east, and he goes to sleep. He hits the rack, which you want to talk about ice water in the veins, right? But that was Raymond Spruance. I mean, he was just he was almost like a machine, you know, just like chung, 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 chung. This is the right answer, you know? And so, yeah, he goes and he hits the rack. And afterwards, you know, he's asked, how could you actually go to sleep, you know, on the end of this battle? He was like, I had good officers. I knew that they would do what they needed to do, and that if worse came to worse, they would wake me. But I needed to be sharp the following morning. And so, you know, without a care in the world, he just goes to his sea cabin and hits the rack, and he's out like a light. That wouldn't have been me, you know.
I was gonna say, I mean, you might know that that's what you need. You need some rest, but that doesn't. There's many times where like, I know I need to sleep, I just can't.
I can't. Yeah, but that was Raymond Spruance. So yeah, that's one of my fave stories from the sort of the aftermath of this battle.
Thank you again so much for your time, John.
Appreciate it. It's been great fun.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank John Parshall once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the 2019 movie Midway. Now, if you want to learn more about the true story, John co-authored this excellent book that I'm holding up in the video version called Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway. You can find a link to this in the show notes right now. Or, as always, you can find everything on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/323. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, Bruno Gaido's heroic scene in the movie really happened. Number 2, the movie doesn't show the Battle of Coral Sea because it doesn't really need to. Number 3, American torpedo planes sacrificed themselves to win the Battle of Midway. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's count it down. We'll start with number 3. American torpedo planes sacrificed themselves to win the Battle of Midway. Right away, we have the lie. As John pointed out, it is a common myth that the American torpedo planes sacrificed themselves to pull the Japanese planes down to sea level, which then allowed the higher altitudes to be opened for the American dive bombers. That means number 2 is true. The movie doesn't show the Battle of Coral Sea because it doesn't need to. John gave us some great historical context about the Battle of Coral Sea, and we don't even see that in the movie. Thanks to John's explanation of what really happened, it makes a lot more sense why the filmmakers didn't show that battle, because the battle itself didn't really impact what happened at Midway. The biggest impact that it had was the ships that got damaged at Coral Sea, meaning what was available for the Battle of Midway. And we see that part of it in the movie. You just don't get that from the movie itself if you don't already know the real history. And now, thanks to John, you do. That means number 1 is true as well. Bruno Gaido's heroic scene in the movie really happened. You know the scene I'm talking about, where Gaido gets into a machine gun of an SPD Dauntless dive bomber on deck to shoot at the Japanese bomber coming toward them. While John pointed out that we don't know if Gaido was the one to actually hit the bomber, it's likely that it was already hit beforehand, but that does not discount his bravery for risking his own life in the heroic moment that we see captured in the movie. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Before I let you go, I want to remind you one more time about the YouTube premiere where John and I will be watching the 1976 Midway movie. Check the link in the show notes for that, or of course, you can just subscribe to the Based on a True Story YouTube channel to get notified as you would for any other YouTube channel. I hope to see you there. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.